Hey there, anime aficionados! This is the true and secret history of shonen action manga. My name is George, and I run The Land of Obscusion, a blog focused around obscure and forgotten anime, manga, video games, and other media. As you can tell with the title image, I'm playing a little joke on Dragon Ball, Fist of the North Star, and JoJo. They will be in this panel, but only at the end. Anyway, if you were to ask someone, where do you think shonen action originates from? Most would understandably answer with one of those three series, if not simply all of them. The fact of the matter, though, is that very little of what they did actually introduced elements of this genre, if you will. Instead, they mainly refined existing elements into how we generally associate and love shonen action manga, which in Japan is called kakdo manga, or fighting manga. All three of those series debuted in the 80s, too, but there's about a good 30 years of history that led up to this. And this panel is to show how things evolved from the early days into what we have now. That being said, though, we will stop sometime in the 80s, because otherwise this thing will become the panel that never ends, as it will go on, my friends. So we're just going to start at the beginning and simply get it out of the way with Astro Boy by Osamu Tezuka, which ran from 1952 to 1968. Now, of course, there was manga prior to this, but Astro Boy is effectively the first modern example of manga, showing a change from short stories based on iconic novels and other works to longer, recurring series that Japanese people can claim as their own. The basic concept, for those unfamiliar, is that it stars Astro, or Atom in Japan, as the series is known in Japan as Tetsuwan Atom, or the Mighty Atom, a robot boy created by Dr. Tenma because he lost his son Tobio in an accident. Obviously, Dr. Tenma isn't thinking straight because of this tragedy, so he decides to create a robot copy of Tobio. But after a few happy years, Tenma realizes that Tobio doesn't age. Apparently, the genius scientist forgot that he created a robot. So Tenma throws Tobio away, who is then rescued by Dr. Ochanomizu and given the new name of Atom or Astro. And the main concept for the manga is an Astro wanting to become a real boy, in a world where robots are treated like second-class citizens. Tezuka told stories focusing on racism, detailing the social climate of the 50s and 60s, and obviously told grander themes as the manga went on. It also shows early examples of the tropes and traditions we know of, like enemies becoming friends, friends becoming enemies, the power of friendship, etc. But when you read Astro Boy, it doesn't feel like a shonen action series. Still, if I don't include Astro Boy, then I'm sure someone will wonder why it was excluded. By the by, we likely will skip over certain manga that you might be thinking of. This is a big subject, and this panel is meant to just be a general overview, so I didn't forget, but rather can't simply list all of them. So next we have 8-Man by writer Kazumasa Hirai and artist Jiro Kuwata, which ran from 1963 to 1968 for only 5 volumes, but it is an important one. Simply put, 8-Man is RoboCop before RoboCop, as it's the story of how Detective Hachiro Azuma is gunned down in the line of duty, only to be reborn by Professor Tani as a superpowered android, with the 8-Man name coming from the idea that he represents the unofficial 8th Precinct. As for his abilities, 8-Man has super speed, super hearing, and can transform from his human Azuma identity into that of 8-Man. Much like how Superman's identity is hidden behind a pair of glasses, 8-Man's is hidden behind a name that literally has 8 in it. Go figure. In essence, this is RoboCop if he was a literal superhero, and while it's never been confirmed, it is possible that 8-Man was an influence in the creation of RoboCop during the 80s, mainly because we did receive the anime adaptation during the 60s. The manga is included here mainly because while Astro Boy was about a robot boy who wanted to be treated as human, 8-Man is a human who's turned into a robot, and the superpowers seen here can be seen as an early indication of humans being capable of superpowered feats. Still, 8-Man is more of a direct influence on later henshin or transforming heroes like Kamen Rider and Super Sentai than it is on shonen action manga in general. Up next is Kamui-den by Sanpei Shirato, not to be confused with the sequel manga, Legend of Kamui, which is what most people know the series in general as. But this original manga ran from 1964 to 1971. Unlike what came before, Kamui-den didn't run a magazine aimed at a shonen audience, but rather ran an alt manga magazine, Garo, which Shirato himself helped create, and it was aimed at older audiences and focused more on the Gekiga movement of the time, which itself was started as a way to make manga for adults rather than the children that manga was generally aimed at the time. This series followed the titular Kamui, a ninja who leaves his clan and becomes a wanted man, always on the run from those who want to kill him. The main thing to take from Kamui-den for this panel is that, while the ninjas seen here were still more like how they were in real life, the way they were portrayed by Shirato, especially in how they fought, would influence the way pop culture in Japan, and eventually the world, would generally portray ninja, mainly through means of weapons and special techniques. After all, the ninja we see now are not all that accurate to the actual historical ninja, and it was Kamui-den that started that shift in what ninja were deemed capable of. Also of note, though, is that while the Gekiga movement aimed to make itself distinct from manga, so you could technically call manga aimed at adults Gekiga, it instead would change the way stories in manga would be told in general, especially in regards to things like dramatic storytelling and romanticization. More than likely, kids started getting curious about Gekiga and, wanted to read them, which in turn prompted manga creators to implement Gekiga elements into their own manga. And in the end, Gekiga kind of died out and just became one giant au revoir of manga itself. But now we're going to start focusing more on the direct evolution of shonen action. So here's Star of the Giants by writer Ikki Kajiwara and artist Noboru Kawasaki. Yes, this is a baseball manga, but one thing to think about in the history of shonen action is that you cannot escape the sports genre. No joke, sports manga is the direct reason why we have shonen action as we know it today, and this panel will show you why. Anyway, Star of the Giants ran from 1966 to 1971 and follows Huma Hoshi, whose father Itetsu played third base for the Yomiuri Giants during World War II before an injury retired him early on. Since their mother passed away, Itetsu has to raise Huma and his sister alone, becoming a bitter man. As for Huma, the manga is all about his rise from playing baseball in Little League, to high school, to playing for the actual Yomiuri Giants. Literally, he becomes the star of the Giants. Naturally, this results in the manga having to use storytelling concepts like time skips in order to advance through Huma's life, and when it was adapted into a TV series in 1968, it became the first ever sports anime, which itself was influential in how to adapt manga into anime, especially in regards to being able to avoid catching up to the manga as it ran by doing things like slowing the pacing down to heighten drama. In fact, there's a story about how an entire episode revolved around a single pitch, but that's a bit of an exaggeration, though said pitch was stretched out for time by focusing on each minutia of it, adding to the tension. But let's return to Itetsu Hoshi for a moment. Becoming a bitter man following his injury, he's infamous for letting out his anger on Huma, by being a dick of a father. Aside from being a prime example of child abuse, though, Itetsu's penchant for flipping over the family table during his rage would wind up becoming a common trope in and of itself, especially when it comes to comedy. Naturally, Itetsu's table flips were kept for the anime. That being said, Itetsu's abusive attitude, both at home and while training his son, were included to help drive Huma to become a better baseball player, because there's no better way to stick it to his abusive father than to not just become a pro baseball player himself, but to be even better. Another iconic part of Star of the Giants, as seen in some of the covers, is the spring suit Huma wears while training, as the tension of the springs forces him to work his muscles just so he can use his arms normally, let alone pitch a ball. Naturally, Itetsu is a terrible father, and forced Huma to do this as a kid. And this helped make for some interesting advertising over the decades, amusingly enough. So next we'll quickly go over Dororo by Osamu Tezuka, which ran from 1967 to 1969. This is the story of Hyakimaru, the son of a wannabe vassal during the Sengoku period who makes a deal with 48 demons in order to gain power. In turn, 48 parts of Hyakimaru's body is stolen by the demons upon birth, which results in his father casting him off like Moses to die, only for the baby to be found by Dr. Jukai, who raises Hyakimaru, gives him his name, and gives him prosthetic limbs. Eventually, Hyakimaru finds out about the demons and vows to kill each one in order to regain all of his stolen body parts. Amusingly enough, Tezuka did admit to only creating Dororo because of the jealousy he felt towards Shigeru Mizuki, who was seeing giant success with Gegege no Kitaro at the time. Being the competitive type, Tezuka decided to create his own yokai manga, only for it to be cancelled a year later before being given a quick and dirty finish, which is what makes all the adaptations, like both anime series in 1969 and 2019, interesting, as they all offer unique alternate endings. As for shonen action, Dororo mainly helped introduce yokai and other monsters to the formula, introducing the idea that the supernatural was a potentially viable option. Let me just say this right away. Without Ashita no Joe, we wouldn't have Shonen Action as we know it today. Yes, this is a mostly realistic boxing manga, but it's that important for this history. Running from 1968 to 1973, and written by Ikki Kajiwara under the alternate pen name Asao Takamori, and drawn by Tetsuya Chiba, this is the story of Joe Yabuki, an orphaned teen living in the slums of Tokyo. In short, Joe starts off as a genuine asshole, conning people out of money, then wasting it on pachinko machines, taking advantage of anyone he can just so he can benefit himself, and beating the ever-living hell out of anyone that gets in his way. It's that scrappy fighting ability, though, that catches the eye of Danpei Tange, a washed-up and alcoholic former boxer who wants to train Joe to be a boxer himself. At first, Joe simply takes advantage of Danpei, but after getting arrested and sent to juvie, he meets Toru Rikishi, a boxer serving his own time, and it's a decisive loss to Rikishi that inspires Joe to seriously become a boxer. During its run, an entire generation became inspired by Joe's rise, not just up the boxing ladder, but also in becoming someone that others can look up to. Even parents, who initially complained to publisher Kodansha that Joe was teaching kids how to become cynical delinquents, wound up loving the young man. The Japanese populace loved this manga so much that 2 actual, real-world funerals were held during its run for characters that died, one at the middle and one at the very end. I could say who the funerals were for, but you can probably guess, as they are 2 of the most well-known spoilers in anime and manga history. Needless to say, the manga itself continues to inspire people to this very day. Its iconic final page has been paid homage to so often that you likely know of it by association alone. Gurren Lagann fans especially know of it. If you haven't noticed yet, there's been a stark lack of anything from the most iconic of shonen manga magazines, Shonen Jump. That's because it didn't debut until 1968, but in its first issue, it had a notable precursor to modern shonen action, Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho by Hiroshi Motomiya. Translating roughly as the ideal boys gang leader, the manga stars Mankichi Tokawa, the roughest, toughest young man in town who's willing to take on anyone who gets in his way, with an early notable moment being when he fights 108 people all by himself, which in turn makes him the leader of a group of delinquents in his town. Eventually, Motomiya moves things over to Tokyo, where Mankichi starts dealing with societal issues of the time, primarily by beating up those who do the people wrong. While Gaki Daisho itself doesn't feature much new in terms of shonen action, it would wind up becoming a major influence on later manga creators, most notably Masami Kuramada and Tetsuya Ohara, who both made their own homages to Motomiya's debut work. However, one thing Gaki Daisho did do that was worth mentioning is that it found itself a notable female fanbase, as Motomiya's art style did have a sort of attractiveness that young women found appealing. There's a story of female fans fighting out where Motomiya's studio was at the time, which resulted in them barricading themselves in front of the door, hoping for a chance to get an autograph. Moving on, we finally reached the 70s with Babel II by Mitsutaro Yokoyama, aka the most important man in manga history you likely don't know about. Yokoyama effectively created the mecha genre with Tetsujin 28 during the 50s, and then later innovated the magical girl genre with Seiya the Witch in the 60s. And with Babel II, he helped popularize giving humans literal superpowers. Running from 1971 to 1973, the story stars Koichi, whose last name differs in pretty much every single manga and anime version of the story. But in general, Koichi is a normal schoolboy who discovers that he's actually the descendant of Babel, an ESP-powered hero from the ancient past who protected the world. In fact, according to this series, the Tower of Babel itself was actually named after him. Koichi then has to fight off the attempts of the evil Yomi, another descendant of Babel who wishes to rule the world. And to assist him, Koichi has 3 allies he can call upon. There's Rotom, the shape-shifting panther, Ropros, the supersonic pterodactyl, and Poseidon, the giant robot. While not the first ESP-powered hero in an action manga, as Dororo's Hyakimaru predates him, Koichi is probably the first example of your standard, everyday person discovering powers beyond his belief and having to use them to save the day. Still, in the end, Koichi remains a schoolboy, so Yokoyama always has Koichi adorned in his standard Gyakudan while fighting evil, and no matter how damaged it gets, it'll always get fixed. Sounds kind of familiar if you're a fan of Fist of the North Star. This was likely done so as to maintain a feeling of familiarity with young readers, who also had to wear Gyakudan when they went to school. and it became so iconic that later manga creators would do the same thing with some of their characters, with probably the most well-known example being Jotaro Kujo in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Stardust Crusaders. In fact, Hirohiko Araki admitted that Jotaro's entire design was nothing more than him paying homage to Babel II. Hence why Jotaro wears probably the worst outfit you can think of when in the middle of the Egyptian desert. So, after all of this, we finally reach the point where the true blueprint for modern shonen action finally starts getting drafted directly. And I mean over-the-top elements, hot-blooded screaming, etc. And it's with a baseball manga that you did never believe was real. Running in Shonen Jump from 1972 to 1976, Team Astro by writer Shiro Tosaki and artist Norihiro Nakajima tells the story of the Astro Supermen, 9 young men discovered by Jay Shiro, a Filipino man who once met Eiji Sawamura as a child during World War II. Sawamura is generally considered the Japanese equivalent to Cy Young, having legendarily struck out all of America's legends time during an exhibition match, and was even offered an MLB contract, and was actually stationed in the Philippines during the war. Where things get loopy is where Shiro states that Sawamura told of a premonition he had about 9 men being born at 9:09.09 on September 9th, 1954, aka Showa 29, all of which bearing a baseball-shaped birthmark. When these 9 men unite, they'll become the greatest baseball team ever, capable of not just beating the Yomiuri Giants, but also the best America has to offer. When Shiro starts gathering these men together, Japanese baseball refuses to acknowledge their existence and tries taking them out early. Oh, and one of the Astro Supermen actually wants to kill his spiritual brothers, creating a group of his own, Team Victory, and challenging our heroes to a literal baseball deathmatch. Yes, I did say kill. You know, this is your standard baseball manga of the time, one where a player will have to catch a ball speeding at them by tanking it with his chest. And training your body for a game requires having your fellow player repeatedly smash a giant tree trunk into your back. Also, players will swing a bat with such force that the only possible way to describe it is by naming it after something like the Andromeda Galaxy. And in order to keep your opposition from getting runs, you need to literally beat the ever-living hell out of them, even if it's your blood sibling that's in your way. Show no mercy. If it isn't obvious yet, Team Astro is, quite frankly, absolutely insane. And I hope you can start seeing how something that's ostensibly a baseball manga laid the general groundwork for shonen action. It didn't erect anything, but it did pour the foundation. But we can't leave Team Astro without bringing up the peak of its insanity. There's a scene where main character Kyuichi Uno has to figure out how he can pitch a curveball unlike any other, one that no one in Team Victory will be able to hit once the deathmatch begins. Since a curveball is a type of spiral, Kyuichi starts eyeing a nearby rotary drill press. This is the 70s. You know what that means! Naturally, this works. Though it ran for 20 volumes, Team Astro only actually covers 3 games, with the Team Victory fight being the focus of the entire second half. Eventually, readers in Japan just tapped out to its insanity, resulting in its cancellation. Still, its influence is undeniable. Even legendary anime director Hideaki Anno is a giant fan of it. Next, we have 2 boxing manga that ran simultaneously, for the most part, in rival magazines, each one being inspired by some of the same works, but going in different directions. First is Ganbare Genki by Yu Koyama, which ran from 1976 to 1981 in Shonen Sunday magazine, and tells the life story of Genki Horiguchi, the son of a talented boxer who returns to the ring only to eventually die during a fight. Genki, in turn, decides to become a boxer to honor his father, with the manga combining elements of Star of the Giants and Ashita no Joe, namely the rise of the main character from young boy to professional adult, and coming from a more downtrodden upbringing, especially after the loss of his father. Ganbare Genki is really more important in the history of sports manga, as it was a direct influence on later works like Touch and Major. But its relevance in our context is in how it shows the difference in how Shonen Sunday was evolving compared to what Shonen Jump did with its own new boxing manga. And from here on out, we'll be focusing solely on Jump, as action is where it mainly innovated at, whereas a magazine like Sunday focused more on character drama, becoming the heart of shonen manga, if you will. Which brings us to Ring ni Kakero by Masami Kurumada. Running from 1977 to 1981, it tells the rise of Ryuji Takane, the son of a professional boxer who died before he could become world champion. Ryuji's big sister Kiku decides to start training Ryuji, who has no interest, but after their mother marries an abusive drunkard of a louse, Kiku decides to run off to Tokyo with Ryuji so as to train her brother into a pro who can give their mother a better life. Eventually, Ryuji becomes interested in boxing after meeting Jun Kenzaki, a young and cocky prodigy who becomes Ryuji's best friend/rival. As the manga goes on, Ryuji, and later Kenzaki, meet and befriend 3 other junior boxers, forming the team Golden Japan Junior as they take on all challengers from around the world to prove their worth, before eventually ending with Ryuji and Kenzaki both going pro and having one last fight for the Bantamweight World Championship. As you can tell, there's a heavy influence from Star of the Giants, Ganbare Genki, and especially Ashita no Joe, as it was created in direct homage to the last one. But Kurumada was also heavily inspired by Team Astro. Though it first started as more of a character drama, a la Ashita no Joe, Kurumada realized that he couldn't simply copy it, so he started taking influence from Team Astro's ability to attract the audience by way of its over-the-top and superhuman feats. Therefore, Kurumada introduced super blows, immensely powerful punches that pretty much broke physics with all sorts of thematic names that later include all manner of visual accentuation to help sell the feel and mood of each one. Readers in Japan eventually called this SF boxing, or sci-fi boxing, and from there it went on to be what's generally considered Jump's first mega hit. In 2014, Shueisha gave RNK a digital release, advertising it as the hot-blooded fighting manga Bible. So let's go into why this manga is the Bible that all later Shonen Action series have followed. First, unlike Team Astro, while RNK did go for a highly over-the-top execution, it still adhered to the rules of boxing, as none of the super blows were anything more than actual punches. Even the aerial-based hurricane bolts became a real thing by way of MMA fighter Kazushi Sakuraba. It also introduced the idea of a team-based tournament to what's otherwise a solo sport, as while each fight Golden Japan Jr. fought was a one-on-one battle, the end goal was to defeat everyone on the opposing team. Today, almost any tournament arc in Shonen Action follows this format. Also of note is that RNK standardized the 5-man band, which has since become the usual amount of lead characters a series will focus around at any given point. RNK even helped innovate the rescue arc, as there's a part where Kiku is kidnapped by a future enemy group, and Ryuji enters enemy territory to rescue her. Today, the rescue arc is a commonly used storyline in Shonen Action. Of course, there's also just a heavy use of previously established tropes and concepts here as well, all finally executed in a way that feels familiar to modern-day readers even after 43 years. Finally, RNK made history by becoming the first manga, in Jump at least, to have its final chapter be published in full color, as though it was an American comic. Since then, Jump has only given 3 other manga this kind of treatment, with Dragon Ball, Slam Dunk, and most recently, Naruto. So if someone ever asks you what manga is the origin of modern shonen action, you now know to answer with Ring ni Kakero. If Team Astro poured the foundation, then RNK set up the framework of the house called Shonen Action. Or hot-blooded fighting manga, according to Shueisha. Then there's Space Adventure Cobra by Buichi Terasawa, which ran from 1978 to 1984. It follows the titular Cobra, a legendary space pirate who went into hiding one day as he became too wanted around the galaxy to do whatever the hell he wanted. He changed his face, blocked his memories, took on the identity of Johnson, and this sounds like the movie Total Recall, doesn't it? Well, Terasawa was obviously influenced by the same Philip K. Dick short story as that film, so it's not too long into the first chapter when Johnson suddenly remembers who he is, and Cobra returns to continue where he left off. In terms of relevance here, Cobra helped bring a pulp influence to shonen action, one where sexuality was a stronger element than before, as pretty much every woman is drawn to be beautiful, while the sci-fi aesthetic helped bring about the idea that shonen action didn't have to solely take place on Earth. Now, any world the manga creator could conceive of was free to use. Following that, we have Kinnikuman, the iconic slapstick wrestler... Wait, that cover art looks way too good to be from the 70s. There! Much better. Anyway, Kinnikuman is the creation of writer Takashi Shimada and artist Yoshinori Nakai, who work together under the pen name Yude Tamago. Running from 1979 to 1987, the manga first started off as a gag manga parody of Ultraman, in which Kinnikuman was the one hero no one wanted to save them, because he was so useless. After seeing the success their friend Masami Kurumada was getting with Ring Kakero, though, Yude Tamago decided to shift focus and make an action manga, utilizing the wrestling motif and references that they had already introduced, and turning the manga into an action series where good and evil Chojin, or Supermen, fought each other in deadly wrestling bouts. Kinnikuman himself, in turn, became the lazy, lackadaisical main character, who would only fight when given no other option, but tended to be the one with the most drive to save the day. While slapstick was still a common element to the manga throughout its run, it was also known for its ability to switch over to violent and bloody action once a fight started in the ring. Never be surprised to see someone literally be torn apart during a fight in Kinnikuman. Being a popular wrestling manga, it's no surprise that Kinnikuman not only utilized actual holds and moves during fights, but it also helped inspire actual moves that have been delivered in the ring itself. The most notable of these is the Muscle Buster, or in Japan, the Kinniku Buster, a move that professional wrestler Samoa Joe has helped make famous outside of Japan. And though he used it like a backdrop, so as to not actually kill his opponent, it still resulted in at least one injury so impactful that the wrestler who took it, Tyson Kidd, had to retire in 2015. However, probably the biggest impact Kinnikuman left on shonen action was the idea that the hero who would constantly save the day would normally be one who doesn't really look to care much about being a hero, instead simply preferring to be lazy or do whatever pleased themselves. Oh, and is almost always hungry. Yes, before Goku or Luffy, there was Suguru Kinniku himself, the OG black hole of a stomach. Yude Tamago also helped introduce a new form of fan interaction, as they allowed readers to submit their own creations for Chojin, while Yude Tamago taking their favorites and implementing them in some fashion in the actual manga. While ending back in 1987, Yude Tamago did eventually return to this original series in 2010, and to this day the duo are still telling new stories with this original cast, almost doubling what the original length was. We now enter the 80s, the final decade of this panel, and we're going to start with Captain Tsubasa by Yoichi Takahashi, an iconic soccer manga that ran from 1981 to 1988. It details the life of Tsubasa Ozora, who has loved soccer ever since he was a baby, when a soccer ball literally saved him from being accidentally run over during a freak accident. So the manga itself tells the rise of Tsubasa as a soccer player, showing him play during elementary, middle, and high school, meeting new friends and rivals on the pitch all throughout. After ending the manga, Takahashi would try doing other series, but eventually returned to Captain Tsubasa in the 90s, and really hasn't looked back since, showing Tsubasa's time as a professional soccer player who has played for real-life teams, and he's even attempted to get into the World Cup and Olympics. He even got married at some point, showing that he can love someone more than soccer. With soccer being known as the world's game, it's no surprise that it saw release all around the world, inspiring kids everywhere to take up soccer, and there are numerous FIFA players the world over who have admitted that Captain Tsubasa was what made them want to play soccer professionally. Except in north of Mexico, where soccer isn't all that popular. I mean, did you even know that the most recent anime adaptation by David Production actually aired on TV in North America with an English dub over on Primo TV? What do you mean you don't know what the hell Primo TV is? It's where Captain Tsubasa aired in English! Anyway, Yoichi Takahashi followed the lead of Ring Kakero and Kinnikuman with Captain Tsubasa, delivering more of an over-the-top style of soccer, one with all sorts of named special move kicks, and often making the pitch seem like it's miles long for dramatic effect. Takahashi even threw in a direct reference to both Team Astro and Ring Kakero with the move Skylab Hurricane. So, the next time someone tries to argue that a sports series that goes over the top is ridiculous and can't be taken seriously, just remind them that one of the most inspirational manga around the world of all time is also one of those series that apparently can't be taken seriously because it's over the top. Okay, we're nearing the home stretch, but first we return to Masami Kurumada with Fuma no Kojiro. Running throughout all of 1982 and 1983, Kurumada's follow-up to Ring the Kakero shows the trials and tribulations of Kojiro, a young ninja of the Fuma clan, and the battles he and his brethren fight. What Fuma no Kojiro brings to the table is that each of the three story arcs told in this series offers something notably different from each other. The first is a standard battle between the Fuma and their eternal rivals, the Yasha, while the last involves Kojiro having to deal with an attempted coup from within his own clan. Main attraction, though, is in the second arc, the Sacred Sword War, in which the manga essentially stops being a ninja manga completely, instead moving focus to a battle between the forces of Cosmo and Chaos, as preordained 4,000 years ago. Where all of the previous manga we covered dealt with rather general concepts like fighting against rivals, being the best, or simply saving the day, the Sacred Sword War deals with things like the concept of destiny itself, and if mere humans can fight against the literal wills of the gods themselves, introducing some heavy existential concepts to shonen action, something that would occasionally be used by other manga afterwards to help keep things fresh. Also, alongside the usual ninjutsu seen by the ninja in other arcs, the sacred swords themselves help introduce the idea of fantastical powers and abilities that aren't mere ESP, though their arc characters are also psychics, because why not, expanding the concept of supernatural powers to a whole new level for shonen action. While not a major part of this history, Fuma no Kojiro does show an early sign at expanding the breadth of the genre beyond its usual standards. So it's about time we finally got to the obvious stuff, right? Well, up next is Fist of the North Star by writer Buronson and artist Tetsuo Hara, which ran from 1983 to 1988. For those who have been hiding under a rock, the manga takes place in the post-apocalyptic year of 1990X and stars Kenshiro, the successor to the assassination art known as Hokuto Shinken, as he travels the land protecting the weak from those who take advantage of the power they have, before eventually getting involved in a power struggle revolving around his adopted Hokuto Shinken brothers and those who fight using the rival styles of Nanto Seiken. A mix of Mad Max and Bruce Lee movies, Fist became an instant hit and started what is now known as the Golden Age of Shonen Jump, which would last for the next 13 years. While not the first non-sports shonen action manga, Buronson and Hara very obviously took what manga like Ring the Kakero, Kinnikuman, and Captain Tsubasa were doing and transplanted them into its own thing, something definitively not sports related, and today it's generally attributed as the first definitive example of modern shonen action, which is honestly fair. While some tend to deride the series as being nothing more than muscle-headed action with no substance, Fist actually has a very sensitive and emotional core to it, and as the series goes on, that becomes more and more obvious, so you have to give it a little bit of a try at first. And, just to be pedantic, I should point out that Fist's iconic Hokuto 100 Crack Fist is not the first example of a special attack that sees someone executing multiple punches in rapid succession. In fact, Ring the Kakero did the super blow Ashita Mugensho first. And while that move is technically an illusion with only a single punch actually being thrown, the similarity in execution to Kenshiro's iconic attack is something to consider. And so, after covering 16 different manga series, we finally reach the real origin of everything shonen action. Akira Toriyama's follow-up to Dr. Slump. Yeah, I really don't need to say anything about Dragon Ball because everyone knows what this series is, even if you've never watched it or read it. Though there are some interesting things to talk about for a little bit. First and foremost, Toriyama is the pure definition of someone being forced into doing action manga, as he originally debuted it as more of a Jackie Chan-esque comedic series, but eventually had to focus more on serious action so as to keep the reader's interest. To be honest, if it was all up to Toriyama, he'd just continue making poop jokes with Arale-chan. As for what else to consider, well, we need to move on to the penultimate manga for this panel first. Following the end of Fuma no Kojiro, which did come to an abrupt end because of his father's passing, Kurumada decided to then debut Otoko Zaka, an homage to Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho that Kurumada had planned to be his magnum opus. Unfortunately, this resulted in a manga that adhered to the previous era of shonen action, rather than continue the style that Kurumada himself helped innovate. Essentially, Kurumada outdated his magnum opus before it even debuted by following an oldest school ethos, so it was quickly cancelled. Don't worry though, he revived it a few years back and is still doing new chapters to this very day. So, After being told that he couldn't make the manga that he wanted to make, he decided to simply make the manga that he knew the mainstream would read, which became Saint Seiya. For those unfamiliar, the manga ran from 1986 to 1990 and focuses on the battles fought by the Saints, the personal guardians of the Greek goddess Athena herself. Depending on where you live, Saint Seiya is arguably just as popular and influential as Dragon Ball. Except for north of Mexico once again, which didn't get the series until 2003, and by that point it was highly outdated. The most interesting thing about Saint Seiya is that Kurumada essentially reintroduced his style to a new generation of readers, who likely only had heard of Ring Kakero, but never actually read it. Therefore, he was able to reuse concepts, names, terminology, character designs, and even plot styles in new ways, effectively taking Osamu Tezuka's star system and applying it to more than just characters. This way, you can have something like Capricorn Shura, who wields the sacred sword Excalibur, which seems similar to Shura from Fuma no Kojiro, who also wields a sacred sword, but otherwise is a completely different character. Meanwhile, Leo Aiolia's iconic attack Lightning Plasma is completely different from Ring Kakero's Venus, who has a super blow named Lightning Plasma. Hell, Kurumada even reworked a Fuma no Kojiro cover for a Saint Seiya cover. Finally, Seiya is known for being the shonen manga that truly found itself a notable female audience, with the yaoi fan scene becoming more notable than ever because of all the Seiya, and Captain Tsubasa, doujin that came about. In fact, Clamp got their start doing Seiya yaoi doujin. But, to quote AC/DC, after all, Dragon Ball is most known for its Z portion, which moved the series into the energy-blasting, fast-punching, Super Saiyaning action that it's beloved for today. However, that part of the story didn't start until October 1988, with the debut of Raditz, which came after Saint Seiya's debut, by about a good 2 years. Likewise, Goku didn't turn Super Saiyan for the first time until March 1991, after Saint Seiya had ended. Could it be that Toriyama was encouraged by his editor to follow what Kurumada was doing with Saint Seiya? Look, all I'm really asking is, what came first? Super Saiyan? Or the power of gold? Also, while I'm picking on Dragon Ball, Frieza's Scouters are obviously just Toriyama making a reference to Blue Comet SPT Lasner, which debuted on Japanese television back in 1985. Finally, and I mean it this time, we end this history with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure by Hirohiko Araki, which debuted back in 1987, and technically is still running to this day, even though it was kind of ended back in 1999, only to then soft reboot back up in 2000, and then continue via alternate timeline stories after that, and why am I going cross-eyed? It's kind of difficult to easily explain JoJo's plot, because it's a multi-generational story about various members of the Joestar lineage over the courses of different periods of time, split up across multiple parts, of which there are currently 8. This allows Araki to make each part a completely different style of story, whether it's Victorian action horror, Indiana Jones style adventure, episodic road trip, semi-slice of life, mafia battles, etc. This way, it continually is able to welcome new readers with each new part, and once they get hooked, they'll want to go back and read what came before. It's all rather ingenious, honestly. After this, you know the rest. To continue would be pointless, as it become the panel that never ends, as it will go on, my friends. There are merits for later series, like Yu Yu Hakusho reinforcing shonen action standards before challenging them to make you think, or Ushio and Tora simplifying things back to focusing on just a pair, or Grappler Baki pushing the boundaries of what one could get away with when it comes to visceral action, or Beat X essentially being Masami Kurumada deconstructing everything he had established in the 20 years since Ring Kakero. Regardless, now you know the general truth behind where so much of what you love about shonen action manga actually came from. Now the next time someone tries to say that Dragon Ball established everything, you too can school them well. After all, the great conversation can only happen when people stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before them, before becoming giants themselves for the next group to stand on. Hey there, anime aficionados. This is George from the Land of Obscusion, and thanks for watching to the end of this video. Either that or you just skip to the end, which, I don't have any control over that. So anyway, this video is the final result of what's definitely been a weird and crazy year so far, to say the absolute least, I'm sure. Anyway, back in January, I was asked to be a featured panelist for Anime Boston. This was something that had never happened to me before, and I was really excited to be a part of a con in that way. Obviously, since that con wound up being scheduled at the time when the pandemic started, that never got to happen. And over time, pretty much every other anime con in the US got canceled over the course of the rest of the year so far. And because of that, I decided that I wanted to at least create a video version of one of my panels, something just as a replacement that I can put out and let people see to kind of act as though I at least did something con-related. I was then later asked, actually, if I wanted to contribute to Anime Lockdown, which was one of the earliest virtual anime cons done this year, but I held off. I do regret not being a part of it because it was a really fun weekend. I did apply for Otakon Online, and in fact this video was originally created for that, but I wasn't chosen, and that wasn't nice for me. Like, I felt kind of down, like, oh man, I didn't go with Anime Lockdown, but now Otakon didn't accept me. And while I was always going to put it onto YouTube, and it is a bigger platform, it obviously would just get lost in the shuffle. YouTube's so gigantic. I wanted this to have at least one crowd that would see it live, even if only virtually. Luckily, Crunchyroll Expo accepted. I was really happy to be a part of that. I would never be able to go to that con because it's in California and I'm in New Jersey, so thank you to Crunchyroll Expo for that. But they had a no music restriction, so stuff like the Also Sprach Zarathustra gag for Team Astro and the Who Made Who gag for Saint Seiya vs. Dragon Ball had to be replaced for the video I made for that con. So what you've watched here on YouTube is the original vision I had made for this video. And again, if you've made it this far, then thank you so much for watching. This was a lot of fun to make. It was also a lot of work, but I hope you enjoyed it. And for the rest of the year, I hope all of you stay strong, stay well, and stay passionate. In the meantime, come check out the blog I run, as it'll be hitting its 10th anniversary this December. That's got to mean something, right?